perhaps I don't know how many of your audience are familiar with ayahuasca, which means the vine of souls, and what it is. But it has influenced the work of many artists working in the medium of painting around the world. And while I'm not a painter, and I'm really quite useless at painting and drawing things, my particular gift, such as it is in the field of writing, and I definitely received a strong creative boost from working with ayahuasca, and a whole new line of thinking opened up for me, and that resulted in the first novel, Entangled, which was published in 2010. And now in War God. And it occurs to me that some ideas are simply so extraordinary that they cannot adequately be covered in the realm of non-fiction, where what you're presenting to your audience is facts, and that when you present a story as fact, there are certain conventions that you have to follow, and particularly if your story is a controversial one. I found, as the years went by and as academic responses to my works of non-fiction grew more hostile, because in the non-fiction realm what I was suggesting was that there could have been a lost civilization more than 12,000 years ago, and this is an idea that's very annoying to many archaeologists who are convinced that civilization, is not more than 5,000 years old. It suggested that they'd got something wrong, and my non-fiction works were very controversial, I think it's fair to say, and came in for a lot of attacks and criticism, and this made me very defensive in my writing and made me bulletproof every argument and have large numbers, sometimes as many as 2,000 footnotes annexed to my increasingly lengthy non-fiction books, so that these attacks could be forestalled. And it's just an incredible freedom to be able to explore the extraordinary ideas that interest me in the realm of fiction, because then there is no need to put up a massively reinforced defensive argument. One can simply go ahead and say what one wants to say, and there is no possibility of furious critics attacking the book for being factually incorrect, since one is not pretending that it is factually correct. One's posture in writing a novel is that this is a work of fiction, this is a work of fantasy. But what I've found is that it's possible to put a huge amount of factual information into the fictional context, and at the same time explore it in extraordinary and interesting ways. And this is why, rather than writing a non-fiction book about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, I wrote War God, which is a novel and which is also a work of fantasy, even though it is underpinned throughout by facts of history, because there was an extraordinary element that I wished to explore in this story, which really would have been quite impossible to explore in non-fiction, and that is the question of the spiritual forces that are at work behind history. It is a simple fact that both Hernán Cortés, who was the Spanish conquistador who led the conquest of Mexico, and his opponent Moctezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs, were both men who believed that they were in contact with supernatural forces. I mean, this is a historical fact, but it's a modern critical academic would look at those beliefs of Cortés and Moctezuma and say that they were deluded, that they were, because of course from the point of view of modern academic criticism, there are no such things as supernatural forces. But I wanted to consider the possibility that Moctezuma and Cortés were not deluded, and that when they had their encounters with specific supernatural entities, there was a reality to those supernatural entities. And in the case of Moctezuma, that entity was the god who the Aztecs called Huitzilopochtli, which means hummingbird at the left hand of the sun, and he was the war god of the Aztecs. And Moctezuma, and again, this is his historical fact, believed himself to be in daily communication with this entity, whatever this entity was. And those communications were facilitated by the consumption on Moctezuma's part of psilocybin mushrooms, which put him into a deep visionary state. And in those trance states, he encountered this entity, this war god, who drove him on to acts of incredible violence and cruelty, and specifically a kind of almost serial killer delight in human sacrifice, which was a core function of ritual in Aztec society. Aztec society was extremely bloodthirsty, and human sacrifices were carried out in honor of the war god, sometimes on an incredibly massive scale. There were 80,000 people were sacrificed at the inauguration. Yeah, I mean, it's just an unbelievable amount. The lines of sacrificial victims stretched more than a mile to each of the 4 stairways of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. And these victims were being sacrificed to inaugurate that pyramid. This was some 30 or 40 years before the reign of Moctezuma, with a previous Aztec emperor who was also in touch with this entity that they believed was their god of war. On the other side, Hernan Cortés was in dreams in contact with an entity that he believed was Saint Peter. Saint Peter had been the patron saint of Cortés since his childhood, and played a key role in his life. And what I'm showing in War God is that these dream encounters with the entity that he construed as Saint Peter also led Cortés to commit acts of extraordinary wickedness and violence, which he believed he was doing, or persuaded himself he was doing, in the name of God. In some ways, a great deal worse. This is the intriguing thing. So, I mean, to give away a bit of the plot, but also to help listeners to understand why I decided to write this as fiction, because it allows an incredibly rich exploration of the implications of these supernatural encounters. What I'm suggesting is that the demonic entity that appeared to Moctezuma as the war god of the Aztecs, in another disguise, because these entities are shapeshifters, appeared to Cortés as Saint Peter, and that the purpose of demons throughout human history has been to maximize the misery of the human race, and to make things much darker and worse than they might otherwise be. And that's what we see in the events between 1519 and 1521, when the Spanish conquest of Mexico unfolded, that these two leaders, driven into frenzies of cruelty by their supernatural visionary encounters with these entities, multiplied and magnified human misery on an extraordinary scale in the Valley of Mexico. And while things were terribly bad under the Aztecs, they ultimately became 100,000 times worse under the Spanish. And it's just another of those facts of history, that the population of Mexico declined from an estimated 30 million in 1519 on the eve of the conquest to less than 1 million barely 40 years later, after the Spanish had taken control. So a gigantic genocide took place in that area. Events of terrible darkness unfolded, and this is the stage, this is the frame in which I set the story of War God. And it is not a story of unremitting misery and horror, because what redeems the story are the positive characters within it, both amongst the Native Americans and amongst the Spaniards, and their capacity for love and courage and human decency in a time of darkness. I mean, writing novels is to a large extent about character and also about plot. Now in this case, the essential plot is already provided by history, and it's a plot just so extraordinary that you literally couldn't make it up. I mean, what happened in those 2 years between 1519 and 1521 was on an epic scale, and it involved the collision of two cultures, and it changed the face of the world. And what took place at that time was just literally incredible. So I'm able to draw from the historical events to give a plot that is very real and based on events that actually happened, but that are yet extraordinary. As to characters, there are many historical characters, true historical characters, who play key roles in my story, such as Cortez himself, such as Moctezuma, and such as an extraordinary woman called Malinal, who is a known historical figure. She actually became the mistress of Cortez in Mexico. But for some, she is a Native American woman, and her origins are somewhat obscure. But her key characteristic, what allowed her to become important in history, is that she spoke two languages. She spoke Maya, the language of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the ancient Mayan civilization flourished, and where indeed there are still Maya-speaking people today. And she also spoke Nahuatl, which was the language of the Aztecs. And Nahuatl is also still spoken today. Malinal spoke both of these languages, and for some reason, which history does not provide us with the answer to, but which I was able to, as a novelist, I was able to make it comprehensible to the reader why this was the case. For some reason, Malinal had a huge grudge against Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor. And what we know of Malinal from history was that she was born into an aristocratic family, but that her father was a minor king of an outlying group of people, not in the center of the Aztec Empire, but in an outlying area, and that she would have been the successor of that king, but the king died. And when Malinal was still a child, and Malinal's mother remarried another man and had a male child by him, and they decided to get rid of Malinal so that male child would have the inheritance, and she was sold into slavery. This is historical fact. Well, in my novel, I have her effectively a sex slave for the Aztecs as a young woman, and then through a series of events prepared for human sacrifice. And this was very common in Aztec society. So we first encounter her in what are called the fattening pens in Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and it stands on the site of what is now Mexico City. In those days, in 1519, Tenochtitlan actually stood on an island in the midst of a great lake called Lake Texcoco, and it was approached by causeways, sometimes as much as 6 miles long, crossing the waters of that lake. Today, of course, Mexico City has no lake. The whole lake has been drained, but this is the location of Tenochtitlan. So we encounter Malinal in the fattening pen. This is where, again, this is another gruesome feature of Aztec society, that when people were to be sacrificed, they would first of all fatten them up, so that they would be, in the Aztec concept, very strange, so that they would be desirable to the god before they were led up the pyramid and their hearts were brutally cut out of their chests. And this is where we meet Malinal waiting for her death, having fallen foul of the high priest, who used her for sex, which was against his vows, because the high priests of the Aztecs were supposed to be celibates. They're, as it were, the official accounts of the Aztecs as to why they were killing people on the execution stone. Part of it is to do with the belief that the end of the world was imminent, and that in order to prevent the end of the world, and specifically the death of the sun, with whom the war god Huitzilopochtli was intimately associated, they would offer up the vital force of human hearts and blood to rejuvenate and nourish and maintain the sun for another day or another year. But if you go deeper, you find that there are constant references to these visionary encounters with entities who are urging the Aztecs to murder and kill in this way. And without those visionary encounters, it's difficult to imagine that they would ever have gone down this road. So this is the reason for it, and this is why I think it's a very interesting story to tell. If I could come back to the issue of Malinal, and she is one of the two heroines of my story. We meet her in the fattening pens in the company of another young woman, a young witch with supernatural powers which are not yet fully developed, called Tozy, who's also going to be sacrificed. And to cut a long story short, they escape from the sacrificial predicament. And while Tozy stays in Tenochtitlan to work harm against Moctezuma, Malinal goes to the coast. And the reason she goes to the coast is because there was a belief at that time, and again, this is one of the mysterious aspects of the story that you just couldn't make up, and it's very, very much a historical fact. There was a belief at that time that a god of peace called Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, would be returning to Mexico, having been driven out long before in some distant epoch by the forces of evil and darkness. That this god of peace, Quetzalcoatl, who was completely against human sacrifice, would be returning, and that he would return in the year in the Aztec calendar that was called One Reed. The Aztec calendar is rather like the Chinese calendar. I think everybody's familiar with the Chinese calendar and the fact that there are 12 named years, you know, the year of the rat, the year of the snake, the year of the tiger, and so on and so forth. It was very similar with the Aztec calendar, except it wasn't 12 named years, it was 52 named years, and they revolved in a great cycle. And in a year one reed, not specified in which cycle it would occur, there was a prophecy that the god Quetzalcoatl would return to abolish human sacrifice and to overthrow a wicked king. And it just happened that at exactly the time that the Spanish conquest began, it was the year one reed. 1519 was the year one reed. Well, in a way, he came back, but in a terrible, dark, vengeful, violent form. And I think if there's anything that we in the modern age can learn from all of this, it is because there has been much talk, there was much talk around the 21st of December 2012 of a rebirth of human consciousness and of the return of Quetzalcoatl again, that we don't need to make the mistakes that our ancestors made, and we don't need to repeat the cycle of violence and wickedness that has been imposed upon the human race. But at any rate, Malinal went to the coast in hope that she would encounter this god of peace and that she would be able to work with him to bring about the end of this awful regime of human sacrifice. And lo and behold, when she gets to the coast, and again, this is historical fact, she's actually taken prisoner by the Maya. And this is at exactly the time that Cortez arrives in Mexico with 490 men. And again, here you have a scenario that it would be impossible to make up. The Aztecs have a standing army of 200,000 men. They are an extraordinarily brutal militaristic power. They are like Hitler's Germany in Mexico in the 16th century. They're a war machine, and on their coast arrive 11 ships containing 490 Spaniards. And at first, the odds seem absolutely insuperable. How can such a tiny group of men possibly hope to overthrow an empire on this scale? I have to say that I have many reservations about the Spaniards. They were extremely negative and cruel in many ways, but they were also men of their time. And we have to remember that in those times, in the 16th century, ethics were completely different from ethics today. In those times, might was right. If you had the force, if you had the power, then you used it to take from others. And that was not considered to be wrong. It was just the way things were, and the way they had been for a very long time. And I have to pay tribute to the astonishing courage of this small group of Spaniards who turn up on this hostile coast, not really knowing exactly what it is they're going to confront, but pretty soon finding out what it is. And they first of all make contact with the Maya. They land on the island of Cozumel, a well-known holiday resort today, and they then sail round the thumb of the Yucatan and come down on the Tabasco River. And that's where Cortez has his first major military encounter. And I show in the book that he's driven on to seek out this encounter by his visionary encounters with the entity that he construes as St. Peter, who is demonic, who is the same entity, in fact, that is misleading Moctezuma. And there Cortez confronts a gigantic Mayan army of at least 50,000 men. And you know, the odds seem absolutely insuperable. How could he possibly hope to win that battle? He has no allies whatsoever. There's just him and his 490 Spaniards. But they have a number of advantages. They have something quite incomprehensible to the indigenous people. They have dogs that are used as weapons of war. They have 100 wolfhounds and mastiffs with them. And these dogs are trained to kill, and they dress them up in armor. So they're huge, savage killer dogs, and they have 100 of those dressed in shining armor of metal plate and chainmail. And dogs were known in Central America, but there was no dog larger than the Chihuahua. These dogs in Central America were used as food items. And they didn't even bark. So the only concept of the dog that was there in Central America was of this passive food item about the size of a Chihuahua. So initially, when they saw the Spanish war dogs, they had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought they were some sort of dreadful supernatural being. They described them as dragons, actually. And then, secondly, the Spanish had another colossal advantage, and that was a small corps of cavalry. Horses had been extinct in the New World for more than 12,000 years when Cortez turned up. There had been horses in the Americas, but they went extinct at the end of the last ice age about 12,000 years ago. So there was no memory whatsoever of horses or what horses were. The Spanish had with them 16 heavy horse, 16 destriers, these massive horses that were used for cavalry charges. And again, the horses as well as the men were armored in steel. So you have to picture this huge horse, which is covered in gleaming steel, and on its back is mounted a warrior with a steel sword, dressed in steel armor. And in the eyes of the Maya who first encountered this cavalry, they just had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. They could not place it in any frame of reference. They understood that the horses looked somewhat like deer, and the men were mounted upon their backs. Now, were the men sitting on the deer, or was this some kind of extraordinary supernatural hybrid creature that they were encountering, which was like a centaur, which was part deer,
anthropomorphic,
and exactly, and part man. They just weren't sure. And then the speed of these things, that they come charging down at you in a close-knit group at about 30 miles an hour, with their hooves thundering on the ground and making the earth tremble. And mounted upon them these warriors with lances, again steel-tipped lances. This was just a shocking, terrifying sight to the Maya, and they had no tactics to deal with it. European armies had been dealing with cavalry charges. European infantry had been dealing with cavalry charges for thousands of years, and they had developed very specific tactics to deal with cavalry charges. The Maya had no such tactics. They were thrown into utter disarray. And then the third thing that gave the Spanish, another thing that gave the Spanish an advantage, was the possession of guns. And these guns were of two types. They had a very primitive musket called the arquebus. It took about a minute to reload and fire each shot with that. They had about 50 of those with them. And they had cannon, a number of small cannon called falconets, and a number of larger cannon called lombards. These also were totally unknown weapons in the Americas. They had never seen anything like a firearm, but they did have traditions of the gods having a weapon that were called fire serpents, which dismembered and destroyed men and made loud noises and emitted clouds of smoke, which was exactly what the guns did. So in every way, this Spanish force looked like a supernatural force to those who first met them. And as a result, in that first big battle at Potonchan, Cortés was able, it wasn't easy. The Maya were not cowards, even though they were confronting this most unusual and terrifying spectacle. Mm-hmm. The Maya put up a massive fight, and for a while it looked as though Cortés' infantry would be destroyed, but then he came into the battle from behind with his cavalry, and at the same time the war dogs were unleashed. And suddenly the whole Mayan force collapsed into a rout. And you have to imagine cannon firing, grape shot whistling amongst their ranks, these huge cannonballs from the Lombards bouncing along, destroying 100, 200 men at a time. Just an absolutely shattering experience. And in the end, Cortés carried the day. This is the other difference between them and the forces they faced in Central America, is that for them, warfare was a science, and they had carefully thought out tactics, and these were all hardened men. Spain, you have to remember, had just gone through 700 years of conflict with Islam. Spain had been occupied by Arab forces, large parts of Spain, and there took place a campaign called the Reconquista, where the Spanish gradually reconquered their territory from Arab occupation. And this had ended, the final battle of the Reconquista was not long before the conquest of Mexico. So these men were hardened in warfare. They'd also had experience of war in Italy, in the Italian wars. And so they were a hardened, formidable force who knew exactly what they were doing and who did not break or panic easily, and who counted upon one another and who counted upon their skills and their tactics. And whose whole objective in warfare was to utterly destroy the enemy on the battlefield with just ruthless, single-minded focus. Whereas both for the Maya and the Aztecs, a battle was a place to take prisoners, who would then be carried off and at a later date sacrificed. So their tactics in warfare were actually not really to kill the enemy on the battlefield, but to disable the enemy and take them prisoner. And this cost them dear when they came up against the ruthless killing machine of the Spaniards, who had no such ideas at all, who were just there to utterly wipe them out. And that's what they did. So we have this giant battle at Potonchan, and then Cortés accepts the surrender of the Mayan chiefs. And this is where he encounters Malinal, the heroine who I spoke of earlier, because she'd been taken prisoner by the Maya on her way down to the coast, pursuing the dream of meeting the god of peace, Quetzalcoatl. And 20 women were handed over by the Maya to Cortez to serve as cooks and servants and bed companions, and one of them was this woman, Malinal. And this is where she injects herself into history. She's the key to the whole saga, because without her, it is very unlikely that Cortez would have succeeded in conquering the Aztecs. She gave Cortez key information which he needed, and she played a very key role, and this is recognized to this day in Mexico, where the name of Malinal, who's the heroine of my story, in Mexico today, Malinal is regarded as a traitor. If you call somebody a Malinchist in Mexico, it's the equivalent to calling them a traitor, because she was considered to have handed over her land and people to the invaders. And she has a bad reputation in Mexico today, which I hope my story will go some way towards rehabilitating, because she was an extraordinary, and I hope so. She was an extraordinary and remarkable character. Again, at any rate, so I have to give the background to this. It's a little bit lengthy, but bear with me. When Cortez first landed in the Yucatan, he had an extraordinary, where everybody spoke the Mayan language, he had an extraordinary stroke of luck, which was that a Spaniard had been shipwrecked there some 11 years before. And that Spaniard had been one of a group of 26, 25 of whom were sacrificed and eaten by the Maya, because cannibalism was practiced throughout this region. But one, whose name was Aguilar, was kept alive in a rather humiliating role, serving a Mayan chief. And this Aguilar had been amongst the Maya for 11 years and thus spoke fluent Maya as well as Spanish. And when Cortez heard that there was somebody who looked a bit like him held prisoner in one of the Mayan villages, he went and grabbed this guy. And Aguilar became Cortez's first interpreter, and in all his encounters with the Maya, Aguilar did the key role of interpreting. And this was very important because Cortez was an incredibly cunning and clever man, and he used language, he used speech, he used the power of persuasion very effectively to secure his dominance. So having a good interpreter was really important to him. But after he dealt with the Maya and accepted their surrender and received these 20 women, amongst them Malinal, as a gift from the Maya, he moved on down the coast. He'd heard by then detailed rumors of the Aztecs, and they had something he wanted. The Aztecs had gold. It was gold that drove the Spanish conquest of Mexico more than anything else. And here's just one of those funny things. The Maya were not that interested in gold. The Maya liked jade. Jade was very important to them. For the Spanish, they just saw it as some kind of green stone that had no attraction to them. And they were a bit disappointed at the limited amounts of gold they managed to extract from the Maya after defeating them. But there were these rumors of this huge empire which was rich in gold, and Cortez decided to go on and take that empire on. So he sailed on down the coast, and he came to the first town that was part of the Aztec Empire. And he landed there and found himself in a position where he couldn't speak to them, because suddenly his interpreter, who spoke Maya, didn't speak a word of Nahuatl, the Aztec language. And they were getting along very badly with sign language and gestures when the woman Malinal, who was carrying pots at that point and working in the kitchens, put herself forward and made it clear that she spoke both Maya and Nahuatl. And Cortez immediately grasped what this meant, that he could now speak to the Aztecs. He would give his words to Aguilar, the Spanish shipwreck. Aguilar would put them into the Mayan language to Malinal. Malinal would then translate them into Nahuatl so that the Aztecs could understand them, and the reverse process would occur. So with these two interpreters, Cortez could suddenly speak to the Aztecs. And again, this is a historical fact. Very quickly, Malinal learnt the Spanish language, and it was possible for her to dispense with Aguilar within a few months. She didn't need him anymore as an intermediary. She could speak Spanish directly to Cortez and serve as effectively as his tongue. And in every image now that we see of Cortez, and many have survived from the Aztec time because the Aztecs made a lot of paintings, In every image of him that has survived, we see Malinal standing by his side, and we see the glyph for speech coming out of her mouth. And she becomes his confidant, his interpreter, and his lover. And she also becomes his advisor. And this is where she gives him the key information that he's going to need in order to defeat Moctezuma. And that is the story of Quetzalcoatl, of the returning deity. And by some mystical process, by some extraordinary coincidence, Cortez and his army have turned up in the year 1 Reed, when Quetzalcoatl was expected to return, and moreover, they look like Quetzalcoatl, because there were these traditions amongst the Aztecs that Quetzalcoatl had been a white-skinned, bearded deity, armed with formidable weapons, who would return from across the seas in a boat that moved by itself without paddles. And Cortez and the Spanish, with their sailing ships, just perfectly fitted the bill. And Malinal's advice to Cortez was that he should not pretend to be Quetzalcoatl. He should always say what he was, but he should leave it to the imaginations of the Aztecs to fill in the gaps. They would think he was Quetzalcoatl, whatever he said, because they regarded their gods as tricksters. And this is what happened in the initial part of the encounter. Moctezuma was convinced that he was dealing with this returning deity, and Cortez, of course, was massively opposed to human sacrifice, and this was again what was expected of Quetzalcoatl, that he would be opposed to human sacrifice. The old legend said that he was a god who put his fingers in his ears at any talk of human sacrifice, and who had ruled that people should only sacrifice flowers and never human hearts and blood. So Cortez, even though he was a warrior and a killer, and there's a famous song by Neil Young actually called Cortez the Killer, which fits the bill perfectly, because he was a ruthless, awesome predator. He nevertheless was able to don this mantle of Quetzalcoatl, and Moctezuma, who'd been carrying out horrific human sacrifices at his own hands, began to feel that he himself, Moctezuma, fitted the bill of the prophecy as the wicked king who would be overthrown by Quetzalcoatl. And he felt somehow that his own wickedness was what explained the incredible cruelty and ferocity of the Spaniards. And it took Moctezuma and the Aztecs quite a long time to figure out for sure that they weren't actually dealing with gods at all. They were dealing with men just like them, but formidably armed and dangerous men. He had an incredible grip on this whole thing, and he was in many ways a remarkable man. He was what you would call a Machiavellian. There was this sort of strategy of calculating leadership that had been proposed by an Italian philosopher writer called Machiavelli, and Cortez fitted perfectly into that mold. He understood human nature. He knew how to manipulate. He knew how to seize every advantage, and at the same time, he was undoubtedly courageous. So after he had acquired Malinal, after he could speak to the Aztecs, and after the Aztecs had been persuaded to start handing over presents of gold to him, this was another of the incredible mistakes that Moctezuma made. He hoped somehow, because Cortez is famously on record for saying, we Spaniards suffer from a disease of the heart, for which the only remedy is gold. They actually handed over huge quantities of gold to the Spanish as gifts in the hope that it would make the Spanish go away. But far from that, it incited the Spanish to, because they thought, Cortez thought, my God, if they give us all this, then what have they got in their stores, So we have to go to the Aztec capital and grab all their gold. It just incited his greed even further. At the same time, he's playing this delicate game of being understood to be a god while he knows perfectly well that he's a man, and he's getting a glimpse of the scale of the Aztec forces as these various embassies approach him, and he sees these backed up by huge armies, and Malinal makes it clear to him that the Aztecs are a gigantic military force, and other people they encounter are terrified of the Aztecs. The Aztecs preyed upon their neighbors. In order to fuel their engine of human sacrifice, they used neighboring tribes as farms, if you like, and they would go and attack them and take their young men and women and drag them off to Tenochtitlan to be sacrificed. So everybody, for example, a people called the Totonacs, were in great fear of Moctezuma. And they communicated this fear to Cortés, and obviously Cortés and his men had seen already examples of human sacrifices taking place. And initially with the Aztecs, when they witnessed this happening, they didn't intervene to stop it because they did not want to provoke a fight earlier than they were ready to have it. And so they knew that they were dealing with a formidable enemy. And in this full knowledge, Cortés did an extraordinary thing just before he led the march into the highlands towards Mexico City. And this was that he destroyed his fleet. He had 11 ships, and of those 11 ships, he sank 10, scuttled them, and had them dismantled, and used the wood from the ships to build houses in a settlement that he created on the coast. And this was done so that none of his men would have any illusions. They would not be going home. They would not be sailing back to Cuba, where they had come from, because there had been a Spanish settlement in Cuba since the time of Columbus. They were going to conquer or die. It was a one-way ticket. So everybody of those 490 Spaniards, now their numbers added to by 100 sailors, making a force of just under 600 men, they all knew that their lives depended on success. They had to win, because otherwise they would all die and their hearts would be cut out, like those victims they had already seen that happening to. And in this spirit, they begin the march into the highlands. And then the next thing happens. Again, as I say, you couldn't make this up. And there are intriguing, as well as Malinal and the other young woman in my story, who are the heroines of my story, Tosi, there is a Native American chief belonging to a people called the Tlaxcalans, and his name is Xicotenca, and he is also a true historical figure who plays a heroic role in my story. The Tlaxcalans were one of those peoples who the Aztecs used as a farm for human sacrifices. And they were repeatedly, for 200 years, they'd been victimized by the Aztecs, and they'd somehow preserved their independence. They were very brave, they fought back, but they were usually defeated by the Aztecs because the Aztecs had much larger forces, and the Aztecs would take away their young men and women for sacrifice year in, year out, like some sort of mythical monster. And the Tlaxcalans fought back. Now, you would have expected, and Cortés expected, because he knew that Tlaxcalans were the enemies of the Aztecs, he expected that they would become his automatic and immediate allies, that he would be able to use them easily to attack the Aztecs. But that's not quite what happened, because the leader of the Tlaxcalans, a man called, as I mentioned, Xicotenca, was truly a heroic character. And when he saw the Spaniards, he didn't believe this stuff about gods for a minute. He knew they were men. He knew they were buccaneers and pirates and just in it for gain. And he looked at them and he looked at the way they behaved, and he saw the future of Mexico. He saw that if they won, then not only the Aztec culture would go down, but that every culture in Mexico would go down, and the whole world would never be the same again. And so for that reason, he actually fought Cortés, even though it was against his interests to do so. And he fought him with incredible courage and almost fought him into the ground. There was an extraordinary series of battles in the highlands on the way between the coast and Mexico City, between Cortés and the Tlaxcalans. And Cortés used every resource at his command, his cavalry, and by the way, there's an extraordinary incident where one of the Spanish horses was actually decapitated by a Tlaxcalan warrior. Neither the Aztecs nor the Tlaxcalans had metal weapons. They used stone weapons. And their particular weapon of choice was a kind of wooden sword with flakes of obsidian embedded in its edges. It was called a macuahuitl, this weapon, and it was a fearsome weapon, actually. And it happened that the horse was not wearing armor on its neck. And in a single blow, one of the Tlaxcalan warriors decapitated it using this obsidian-edged wooden broadsword, which again made it quite clear that these animals were not supernatural. They could be killed. And tremendous battles took place. And Cortés, again, as I show in the book, advised by the demonic entity that he believes is St. Peter, carried out horrendous massacres against Tlaxcalan villages and towns. And it was only by the process of these cruel massacres, plus some extraordinary victories in battle against large Tlaxcalan armies, that finally the Senate of Tlaxcala forced Xicotenca, the chief, to submit to Cortés and to say enough is enough. We cannot fight this man. If they had only known, Cortés was within a day of giving up at that point, because that close. The Tlaxcalan resistance had been so powerful, and the call amongst his men was to give up, retreat to the coast as fast as possible, send the one remaining ship to Cuba, and get some ships over to get us out of there. And this was very much in the minds of the Spaniards at that point. But Cortés's strategy worked, and the Tlaxcalans gave up before the Spaniards did. And suddenly then Cortés was welcomed into the city of Tlaxcala, and he suddenly has 100,000 Tlaxcalan auxiliaries who are serving him and who have a historical enmity against the Aztecs. And Xicotenca comes over and becomes effectively one of Cortés's generals in the next unfolding element of the drama. This was karma that happened to Moctezuma. The Spaniards were a kind of instant karma, because if Moctezuma had been a different kind of leader, if he had not behaved with such cruelty to neighboring peoples, if he had not carried out these wicked acts of human sacrifice and been hated by every culture around him, then instead of Cortés being able to win allies as he went along, he would have been met by a united opposition and very easily stopped. But it was Cortés's ultimate success in bringing the Tlaxcalans over to his side, and he had to fight for it, but he did succeed. That was key in the defeat of Moctezuma. And the Tlaxcalans were not alone. Other peoples also backed the Spaniards in the hope that they would get rid of these horrific tyrants called the Aztecs. I feel that I'm learning. In a way, I'm 62 years old now, and I've been writing non-fiction all my working life. I was originally a journalist, but I started writing books my first book was a travel book about Pakistan, actually published in 1981, and I went on from there to write many non-fiction books. And also in the process of writing non-fiction, one learns as one goes along. You get better at it. It's like anything, like running or singing. Any skill, the more you practice it, hopefully the better you get. And with fiction, I think it's the same. I've learned a lot about storytelling. I've always felt that I was first and foremost a storyteller, and that's what I was doing even in non-fiction. The basic drive of a narrative, a story that will engage the reader, that the reader will become involved in and want to continue turning the pages on. That is shared between non-fiction and fiction. But then in fiction you have these additional elements of character and plot, and the very definite need for a story to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There has to be a structure there. Yes, I've definitely learned about this. My first novel was Entangled, and I had to really work through all the dynamics of fiction writing while I was writing that, and all the lessons that I learned from writing that I've been able to apply to the War God story. The publishing industry thinks in terms of brands, because publishing these days isn't run by editors anymore. It's run by marketing men, and marketing men don't think in terms of good stories. They think in terms of brands, and they see me as a non-fiction brand. I detest being put in a box like that. But that's how I've seen. So I've had very little support from the world of publishing. I mean, my UK publisher, who are Hodder and Stoughton, they accept that I'm writing novels, and they're happy to publish my novels, but they don't put a lot of energy or effort into it because they feel that somehow it won't work because my audience are used to reading me as a non-fiction author, and are unlikely to go and pick up my novels as well. So it's up to me to do the work and make the effort to persuade my existing audience that my fiction is worth taking a look at, and also hopefully to reach a new audience who only read fiction and have never read non-fiction books. And it is like completely reinventing myself in my 60s. It's like, in a way, it's like starting again. It's like starting a new career. I think it's very exciting. I love it. I feel very positive about it, and I welcome the challenge, and I'm glad to have the privilege and the opportunity to be able to do this, and to take these risks, if you like, with my career, and in order to express myself creatively, and do what I feel called to do. It's a great opportunity and a nice change of direction for me, and I love writing fiction. It's when I watch kids playing computer games, I'm a bit like that when I'm writing fiction. I get lost in the world that I'm describing and writing about. I immerse myself into that epoch. This period, okay, we're talking 1519 to 1521. It's coming up to 500 years ago, quite near to 500 years ago. The Spaniards at that time were literate, and many of them kept journals, and afterwards wrote accounts. Another one of I have heroic characters amongst the Spaniards as well as villains, and I have heroic characters on the Native American side as well as villains. And one of my heroic Spanish characters is a known historical figure who was a soldier called Bernal Diaz. And Bernal Diaz was a young man at the beginning of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. He was in his early 20s, and he fought his way through the whole conquest, and he lived to a ripe old age. He lived actually well into his 80s. And as an old man, he had kept a journal when the conquest was taking place, and as an old man, he sat down and turned that journal into a book, which was Bernal Diaz's The Conquest of New Spain. And he turned that into a lengthy book which describes in detail all of his experiences during the conquest. And it's a sad story in a way, Bernal Diaz, because he says that he made no money out of the conquest. He never became a rich man. And he said at the end of his life that this is the only thing that I have to leave to my children, are these memoirs that I've recorded. And in fact, his journal, his book, vanished for about 150 years, and eventually the manuscript copy was found in a library in Spain and circulated after that. So there's a detailed first-hand account, and there are many others. Many of the other conquistadors kept first-hand accounts and later published books. So I've got a whole lot of first-hand, what you would call primary historical sources from the Spanish point of view on the conquest of Mexico. And then the Aztecs also kept records and wrote accounts. The Aztecs were also a literate culture. And there were friars who came with the Spaniards and remained on after the conquest was over, who made a point of learning the Nahuatl language and translating Aztec accounts, whether verbal or written, into Spanish. What I've been able to find is that in some cases the same battle is intimately described by both sides, and you have a huge amount of detail there to draw on, and to serve as a resource for the novel. Playground of research, and there's a surprising document. I'm looking at 3 or 4 shelves of books that I own on the single subject of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Cortez's secretary, for example, gave an account. There were many accounts. Cortez himself wrote detailed letters running to hundreds of thousands of words in the end, because part of his Machiavellian campaign was to win the support of the Spanish king. See, Cortez, when he mounted the conquest, he was undertaking an illegal operation. Cortez led the conquest from Cuba, where the Spanish had been, as I mentioned earlier, since the time of Columbus. And Cuba was governed by a man called Diego Velázquez. And Diego Velázquez and Cortez had a strained history. And there was a point where Diego Velázquez had thrown Cortez in prison to do with a woman who Diego Velázquez favored, who Cortez had made pregnant but was refusing to marry. Eventually Cortez agreed to marry her and was released from prison. And then he seems to have, he clearly didn't like Diego Velázquez at all, but he sweet-talked Velázquez into giving him command of the expedition that would go to what they called the New Lands, which was Mexico, to mount the conquest. And Velázquez put some of his own money into that, and Cortez got his fleet of 11 ships together, always intending to take it away from Velázquez. Velázquez got wind of this and sent men to arrest Cortez again, but Cortez's own spies reported this to him. And on an incredible night, he sailed without the permission of Velázquez. As Velázquez was coming to arrest him, Cortez ordered the fleet to sail. And they sailed from Santiago to Cuba, and the conquest began. So he had set out without the permission of his governor. It would be a very difficult situation for him. And secondly, then he needed to legitimize what he had done. And the only way to legitimize that was by success and to win the support of the King of Spain, who could overrule the governor of Cuba. So Cortez wrote these enormous letters to the King of Spain, and those letters form an amazing resource for anybody wanting to study the Spanish conquest of Mexico, and I've drawn on them extensively. And again, you can see the Machiavellian mind of Cortez at work. He threw everything into the pot, and one of the things he threw into the pot was that just before they began the march into the highlands to take on the Aztecs seriously, by which time they had already received huge presents of gold from the Aztecs, I told you that he burnt his ships. One was left on the coast of Cuba, and one was sent to Spain. And that ship that was sent to Spain contained all the gold that they'd been given so far as a gift to the Spanish king, which was designed to bribe him to take Cortez's side, which eventually he did. And Cortez is the man whose name goes down in history. He talks, and Velázquez was ruined actually in the end, because Velázquez did an extraordinary thing. Okay, so let me just return to the story for a moment. Cortez defeats the Tlaxcalans, and he then has his allies. He has 100,000 Tlaxcalan auxiliaries. Malinal is by his side, and they continue the march towards Mexico City. On the way, they come to a city called Cholula, and there, which is an Aztec city, and there they conduct the most horrific massacre. 5,000 citizens of Cholula are murdered by the Spaniards. And this is done coldly and calculatedly by Cortez to send a message to Moctezuma. The message is, if you oppose me, this is what will happen to you. They then march on, and they come to the shores of the lake in which Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, stands. And Moctezuma, by this point, is a quivering wreck, despite his huge armies. He's just terrified of Cortez. He still believes Cortez is a god, although there are others on his council who are advising him clearly that Cortez is a man. Moctezuma can't make up his mind. So what he decides to do, rather than fight Cortez, is to invite Cortez into Mexico City. And there he thinks to himself, once I have these gods, if they are gods, or men if they are men, inside my city, then if I choose to do so, I can massacre them, because Mexico City. Tenochtitlan at that time, as I mentioned, is in a lake. You get into it along causeways, and the bridges on the causeways can be removed. So there would be no possibility of the Spanish fleeing the city. And so this is what happens in November of 1519, is that Cortés and his little army, most of the Tlaxcalans are obliged to stay outside, are invited into Mexico City. There's an amazing encounter with Moctezuma where Malinal does the interpreting and famously stares Moctezuma straight in the face. No woman had ever done that. And this is partly what tells us about her feelings, her hatred towards Moctezuma. And in go the Spaniards, and they're given the palace of Moctezuma's father as their headquarters, right in the heart of Mexico City, in front of the Great Pyramid, where the human sacrifices are taking place daily. And they can see exactly what they're up against. And this is where Cortés pulls off an amazing masterstroke, which is that after 4 days inside Mexico City, forestalling the likelihood that the Aztecs will attack him, he marches over to Moctezuma's palace and takes the emperor of the Aztecs hostage. He just takes him prisoner. And he says to him, "You will do what I say, or I will kill you." And of course, this is translated through this woman Malinal. And amazingly, Moctezuma, whose own guards are in place, who is all around there, crumbles, and he accepts the status of hostage, and he accepts to be taken back to the palace he'd given to the Spaniards, and there he becomes their puppet. And for the next 6 months, this is where Cortés almost pulled off a bloodless coup. He really was so close to doing it. Moctezuma was his puppet. Cortés was ruling the Aztec Empire through Moctezuma. He was just piling in huge quantities of gold and jewels. Everything was going very, very well. And then word comes that a new Spanish fleet has turned up on the coast of Mexico. And that Spanish fleet has not been sent to support Cortés. That Spanish fleet has been sent to attack Cortés, because that Spanish fleet has come from his rival, Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, who is jealous at the incredible success of Cortés. So Cortés, he's there in Mexico City. He's left 200 men at the coast. He has 300 or 400 men in Mexico City. He has to divide that force in Mexico City, send down, leaving only 100 guarding Moctezuma. He marches to the coast, and although the new Spanish force is 1,000 strong that has arrived on the coast, again, it's a sign of Cortés' military skill. He defeats them in battle with his tiny force, and he takes captive their general, and he absorbs the new Spanish force into his army. Stroke of luck after another. Then he marches back to Mexico City, and there in Mexico City, Pedro de Alvarado, who is an incredibly cruel Spanish character, a historical character who's also a central figure in my novel, has conducted another massacre. And finally, that's the last straw for the Aztecs, and the Aztecs have risen against him. So when Cortés gets back to Mexico City, he finds his men beleaguered, surrounded by a huge Aztec force. He does relieve them, but 5 days later, the Spanish are expelled from Mexico City. They lose 600 men that night. Remember, their army has been reinforced by this new army at the coast that Cortés has just defeated. And it's called the Sad Night, the Noche Triste, in Spanish. And cut a long story short, they get out of there, the 400 survivors. They march back to Tlaxcala, where they lick their wounds for a few months. And then Cortés does this other thing that puts his efforts on the scale of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He knows that he cannot successfully surround and besiege Mexico City, because it's an island on a lake at that point, unless he has ships. How do you get ships in mountains? Up in the mountains of Tlaxcala, he builds 13 ships. They are called brigantines, each of them capable of carrying 50 or 60 men. He builds them, he tests them out on a lake in the mountains, then he dismantles them, and then he has them carried by 8,000 Tlaxcalan bearers all the way to the shores of Lake Texcoco, where the Aztec capital stands. And then they're rebuilt. And then the siege of Tenochtitlan begins. And over the next year and a half, there's just a horrific, incredible story of battles and warfare. and gradually the Aztecs are worn down, and eventually Cortez captures Mexico City, and the conquest is over. And key in this is these ships that he has built and transported from the mountains to the lake. So it's just an amazing story of human endeavor. It's also a story that changed the face of the world and that shaped the modern world we live in. And that's again where I come back to this issue that we began with of the spiritual forces at work in history. That I take this seriously. I believe that demonic influences have played a role in human behavior, that we are surrounded by invisible supernatural realms, and that in altered states of consciousness we can gain access to these realms, and that the ancient idea of angels and demons has merit to it, and that human culture has been terribly influenced by forces of darkness and evil. And those forces of darkness were massively at work in the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Just 20 years later, the same model was applied in the conquest of Peru by Pizarro. And then the whole story of colonialism and slavery and the negative role that the West has played in the world took shape because of that. If Moctezuma had been a different man and had been able to defeat Cortez and had been able to mobilize allies and defeat Cortez, the whole history of the world, absolute turning point in human history. Everything that we see in the modern world and in the relationship between the rich countries of Europe and the rest of the world that went down from there, including the terrible genocide of Native American Indians in North America, that followed over the subsequent hundreds of years. All of this was a direct follow-on from the conquest of Mexico. So this is why I felt that it was a key story to write a novel about, and why I felt it was important to get into the supernatural as well as the purely historical aspects of the story. It was a truly remarkable period of history, and it hasn't really been covered in a novel before. There is a great novel called Aztec by Gary Jennings, but it deals primarily with the